Hello again everyone and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John and as always thank you so much for being here. Good topic for you today. Let's do it. What's something that was considered to be a legend or a myth but eventually turned out to be true? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. One of my favorites is Lake Nyos in the Republic of Cameroon. The local legend was that an evil spirit or a monster lived in the lake and would come out at night to kill anyone who lived too close to the lake. One of the local groups, the Bafmen, settled in the high ground near the lake due to the legends. Different groups moved into the area in the mid-1900s and lived closer to the water's edge, disregarding the customs of Bafmen. In 1986, nearly 1,500 people living near the lake were found dead. Those who lived in the higher ground were fine. It turns out the lake was very deep and would essentially become carbonated. A landslide could trigger a release of CO2 from the lake water. On that night in 1986, an enormous release occurred, and since CO2 is heavier than air, anyone in the lower areas simply suffocated and didn't wake up. So, while the myth about the evil spirits wasn't entirely true, there really was something in the lake to fear. It wasn't clear whether King Richard III was really deformed, or if people who wrote about him after he died were just making it up. Some people thought he must have been physically normal, but writers added the deformity to make him seem more hateable. When his remains were found, there was evidence of severe scoliosis that would have made one shoulder higher than the other. Not a hunchback, but at least a bit lopsided. Mountaineers found a small lake in the Himalayas, absolutely covered in bones. As they searched, they found the bodies of at least 200, as well as potentially up to 3 times that many in the lake itself. All of them died of blunt force trauma from what appeared to be a rock slide, but there was no sign of any such rocks. According to legend, Raja Jasaval, the king of Kanauj, was traveling with his pregnant wife Rani Balampa. They were accompanied by servants, a dance troupe, and others as they traveled on a pilgrimage to Nanda Devi Shrine for the Nanda Devi Rajat, which takes place every 12 years. As they traveled, they were overcome by a sudden, severe hailstorm with extremely large hailstones. The storm was too strong, and with nowhere to take shelter, the entire group perished. It was long thought to be a legend, but now they think it actually happened, almost exactly the way it was said to have happened. Ball lightning is pretty fascinating. There have been anecdotal reports of it for hundreds of years, but it was hard to document because it doesn't last long and it couldn't be photographed. It's also hard to create it in a lab, but it is acknowledged now that it does exist. I first read about it in one of the Little House on the Prairie books and thought it was wild. I wasn't sure if it was real or some kind of hallucination. Saraswati River in India was considered a myth, a stuff of mythological texts and such. No one could actually confirm its existence, but there was a millennia-long speculation about why did the river feature so much in late Bronze Age Vedic Indian literature, if it was not real, alongside actual and real major rivers. It was even deified as a goddess, a prospect reserved for major rivers. Yet, no one had an idea about where it was later on. Fast forward to the 19th century, Indians and the British, surveying the land, discovered an entire dry river valley in the middle of the desert, not far from the location mentioned in ancient texts. It roughly runs behind the modern India-Pakistan border. Many wondered where the lush and prosperous Saraswati floodplain mentioned in Vedic texts went, and why did the river dry up? The most common theory today is that the river, while real, suffered drastic effects in the massive climate change of late 6th century AD and lost its course. The mention of it in imperial texts disappears by the next century. Parts of the river lingered around until 9th century, but increasing desertification eventually killed it completely, and the river passed from memory. It remains like that today, just a faintly recognizable river valley in the middle of the desert. Prion diseases like mad cow and fatal familial insomnia and kuru. They're caused by a protein malformation and yet are communicable, which was thought to be impossible by epidemiologists, and yet here we are with prion disease caused by genetics, fatal familial insomnia, by consumption of brain tissue, mad cow, Creutzfeldt-Jakob kuru, and now by pathogen, chronic wasting disease. The case was essentially cracked in part by a teenager in Italy. The scientist who first made the discovery in Papua New Guinea was a pedophile, so he was discredited, which is part of why it took so long. There's a fascinating book called The Family That Couldn't Sleep, I think, that traces the history and the science behind the prions. The Hoan Kiem turtle was a legendary creature living in Hoan Kiem Lake in Vietnam. In the 15th century, the golden turtle god, Kim Quy, appeared to the Emperor of Vietnam and gave him a sword. After a war with the Chinese, the turtle reappeared and took back the sword. Sightings of the mythical turtle persisted on and off for hundreds of years, until in 1967, a fisherman actually found or caught the turtle and beat it to death with a crowbar. Multiple sightings since then confirmed the turtle or turtles in the lake are very similar to, or possibly, the same creature as that. The Living Islands. A group of sailors land and explore a new island, one they've never seen before, in an area they know well. It is covered with ancient waterlogged trees and the corpses of unknown eldritch creatures. Spanning 100 or so meters, the isle appeared to have risen overnight. During the night, they light a fire from the driftwood. Moments later, the great beast upon whose back they now rested gives a great fiery roar and dives beneath the waves as they scurry back to their ship, which is nearly pulled down by the anchor. There are versions of this from the Mediterranean, the Western Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea. Despite the strange co-occurrence of the thousands-of-year-old myth, everyone thought this was a completely baseless until an island rose from the depths outside Pakistan a few years ago, floating on a cushion of methane. Some hapless locals go abroad, light a few of the vents, and lo and behold, the island roared fire until it sank a few days later. Sure, it's not alive by today's standards, but that seems like a fair guess by the ancient sailors who probably spent the rest of their lives trying to tell people. The tranquil lake. The locals in a region of Africa repeatedly told European settlers that a particular lake was cursed. It had been holy to some old tribe whose god got angry and slew them all. There was nothing strange about the lake itself, except that it didn't contain the usual fish. Settlement and forced resettlement began shortly. Better part of a century later, the curse struck and the village was completely wiped out. The local populace, most of their cattle, and nearly all smaller life died. The deaths of every insect, bird, and beast of the jungle within miles made for the eerie silence, which had given the lake its name in ages past. Hundreds had died. The survivors, shaken to their very core, whispered of demons and the stank of brimstone. The dead appeared to have died without wounds or signs of disease. Later, the local priest spoke of how the lake had turned blood red and remained so for weeks, beyond religion, no one knew what had happened, and after a time, the rest of the world concluded the tall tales of the deadly Red Lake must have been bullshit. That changed with the Lake Nyai's disaster a century later. Edit, fixed grammar, and converted a crap translation to a slightly better one. I think it's pretty fascinating how you could have, thousands of year-old stories of ancient sailors reporting a giant beast, which probably felt that way to them. Then just turns out to be a gas buildup. So eventually the mystery comes out of it, but you could still see how they felt that way, right? Anyway, have a good day, guys. Cropsy. I remember him being brought up in a thread many, many years ago in the early days of Something Awful in a "What's a local scary thing for you" thread. It was just a spooky myth about a spooky boogeyman who lived in stream tunnels under the CUNY, Staten Island, and the Willows Brook State School, who kidnapped, molested, and murdered little kids. Turns out, he was a real dude called Andre Rand, who kidnapped and murdered an estimated 5 children and special needs adults over a period of 12 years in the 70s and 80s. He had been in prison since 1988 for kidnapping, but came back into the spotlight in 2004 when he was brought to trial and convicted for a second kidnapping. New York State lacks a statute of limitation on kidnapping. In 2009, a documentary, from what I understand, it's very sensational and plays up the supernatural Satan worship scare angle, called Cropsy, was released. Ernest Hemingway was convinced that the US government was actively spying on him and monitoring his every movement. He was so adamant about it that he became severely paranoid, but people, including his family and close friends, generally disregarded that claim, assuming this was a result of his deteriorating mental health and alcoholism. It wasn't until he committed suicide that the FBI revealed they had been monitoring him ever since World War II for fear of him being a communist. Now, it's believed this surveillance is one of the causes that led him to become depressed and the ensuing suicide. The Japanese Divine Wind legend, said to have saved the Japanese from 2 Mongol invasions and ultimately play a major role in the fall of the Mongol Empire. Turns out it did happen, but the reason the Mongols' boats sank was because the Chinese shipbuilders intentionally built a fault into the ships that would cause them to sink once wind or sea conditions hit a specific level. The Mongols, who knew nothing about ships, were totally oblivious to this subtle built-in error, the divine mistake. A boiling river in the Amazon, TLDR, of the story as I heard it on Weird Wonders of the World. Back in conquistador days, Spanish explorers went into the jungle. When they came out, one of the many stories they told was of a boiling river that killed any living thing that fell in. Some guy heard these stories growing up, went into geology, and asked around about it. Nobody in academia knew of any such river, so he gave up. He mentions the topic among family in a "too bad it's not real" way, and his aunt says, "But it is." She takes him to some locals, and he just takes a trip to see it. It totally is, and it is boiling, not just pretty hot. It's way hotter and larger than anything else in the area, and they're not sure yet why or how that much geothermal activity is going on at that spot. The Mole Man of Edge Hill in Liverpool, UK, if I remember right, this was the myth about a rich guy who built a massive tunnel network under Liverpool and lived down there. Turns out he did, and he did it all because of mass unemployment. He was rich dude who did not want to see all the people out of work, so he hired them to build a network of brick tunnels under his house. Later, he went a bit crazy and lived down there. The people who built the tunnels then went on to build all the train tunnels in Liverpool, which Some actually intersect the mole man's tunnels, and you can see where they've been bricked over. In Portugal, I can't remember where exactly, there was this tradition where every year the local priest would bless a batch of bread. The bread would then be kept in a closed chest in church, and would be given only to people who were ill. The bread would only be replaced the next year, so if you were unlucky enough to get ill 8 months after having the bread blessed and stored, you would be given moldy bread. This, however, proved to be effective sometimes, actually saving people's lives, though not by direct divine intervention, for the mold in the bread would fight infections, just like penicillin. I always found this story quite fascinating. Funny fox-sized ants that dig gold. Gold? Okay, not quite. Way back when, a Greek fellow by the name of Herodotus decides that he wants to write this new thing called history. As that had never been done before, let's just say it's kind of all over the place at times. During one of his many tangents, Herodotus mentions that in India, there are these fox-sized ants that dig burrows in a desert. Turns out there be gold in them sand dunes. So, while the ants down digging away, the locals would sneak on in and gather up the gold. Of course, they had to sneak because these ants also had some Smaugian love for their gold and would chase down and kill anyone who couldn't get away. Seems like some real BS, right? Well, not entirely. See, Herodotus didn't see most of the stuff he wrote about. He just related what he was told. Not everyone spoke Greek, so numerous, and sometimes what he was told might have gone through a bit of a game of telephone. As it turns out, the Persian word for marmot is pretty close to the word for ant. As it turns out, there's a kind of marmot in the area of Pakistan that does make large burrows. And in the course of making those burrows, they kick up a lot of gold dust. And for generations, locals around the area have gone to those burrows and collected some of that gold. The Mausoleum of the first Emperor of China. It was first mentioned in later ancient historical records, but widely thought as fanciful, with descriptions of an underground replica of China with rivers of mercury. Then a farmer digging a well dug up the head of a terracotta warrior, and archaeologists found higher levels of mercury in a nearby hill that turned out to be the giant pyramid mound of the burial complex. Imagine reaction of the farmer finding a colorful statue head only to have the colors on the head quickly fade as the paint oxidized after being sealed for millennia. The main chamber of the mausoleum is still sealed to this day, with fears that unearthing it would damage whatever was sealed inside thousands of years ago. The Dead Sea Scrolls. From 1946 to 1956 and 2017, over 1,000 were discovered hidden in caves and tunnels outside the Hellenistic Jerusalem. The scrolls are an important source of history, linguistics, and biblical significance as they contain writings from the 1st century AD, making them some of the oldest written documents to be put in Bible canon. The only known biblical text found to be older are the priestly blessings from the Book of Numbers, dated 600 BC and excavated in Jerusalem at Ketef Hinnom, and a single piece of Leviticus, excavated at Ein Gedi, dated at the 1st century AD, and the third oldest piece of the Torah. The scrolls are written in multiple languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Greek, and Latin. Homo Florenus. While there's no doubt there's a skeleton, here's my take that maybe not a lot of people know. Lots of cultures have stories of magical, mystical little people. Irish have leprechauns, Hawaiians had menehune, etc. Well, the Indonesians had ibu gogo, rough translation, gluttonous granny, or grandmother who eats anything. So, this story was relayed to a Dutch ship that stopped to resupply about 400 years ago by a village elder. Please bear in mind, we're talking rough, really rough estimates on the time here, being filtered through dramatically different cultures, interpreters, and maybe ways of accounting chronology, generations, etc. Same as the menehune and leprechauns, but in stature only, not magic mentioned ever, but couldn't talk like us, humans, but could parrot back words when spoken to, would raid village gardens, steal homemade liquor, etc., treated kind of the way monkeys seem to be in Southeast Asia now. Amusing pests, but smarter, a lot smarter. Raiding got worse. Eventually some infants and toddlers were taken and eaten. Now, ibu gogo were not in large numbers to begin with. It was mentioned they lived in mated pair groups. No mention of offspring. Maybe they didn't forage, dunno. And, remember before this, the villages considered them pests, but entertaining ones, and would allow them to scavenge. They especially liked the abandoned reed thatch, used to make nests in their caves. So, to stop the baby-eating raids, which Jane Goodall had recorded proof of chimps doing with human infants, the villagers laid out a giant, big, fresh pile of thatch and let them take it back to their caves, which they promptly burnt till nothing remained. The elder said they saw 2 run off into the jungle, but he never saw another one. The island the Dutch were told this story is now called Flores, where H. Florenus was discovered. Might be bullshit, don't know. I just knew it from loving folklore and living in Southeast Asia for a bit. When the fossils were found, I thought, holy shit. The ancient historian Herodotus talks about giant gold-digging ants from India. For years, archaeologists of ancient historians have used this one as the examples of why Herodotus is the father of lies rather than the father of history, but a story has possibly been proven true. When Herodotus recounts the history, he makes it clear that it's a story which has been told to him by the Persians, not a first-hand account. Therefore, he's just relaying what he has been told. The land, which was mentioned, is thought to be a place high up in the Himalayas, where there are marmots, which actually do dig up gold dust from the soil when they make their burrows. The indigenous people of this area silt through the sand raised by the marmots to collect the gold from it. It's believed that there was a miscommunication because the Persian word for marmots is similar to the mountain ants, apparently. So, poor old Herodotus was just translating as best he could. I'm surprised nobody has mentioned Purple Aki. When I grew up, everyone in the northwest of England knew the legend about this guy who would R young boys and carve his initials into their arse cheeks. The details would vary in different areas, but as we got older, we all assumed it was nonsense. Turns out, he's a real guy, and the reality is far, far stranger than the legend. He is indeed a giant black guy, so Blackie's purple. That seems to be attracted to teenage boys, but he has this deep obsession with feeling their muscles. And I mean obsession. He's been accused of SA for over 20 years now, hanging around gyms and bodybuilding competitions to ask people if he could feel their muscles. confronting them with bizarre facts about their families that he'd learned somehow. He even served a prison sentence for manslaughter after a guy was so disturbed by him that he ran away and accidentally fell into a live railway line and electrocuted himself. Aki was actually banned by an actual court from touching mussels. He now lives in Manchester, and people see him all the time. He's gone from being an urban legend boogeyman to a local celebrity. Force Ape. For many years, people thought the game didn't exist and that all was left of the game was the Nintendo Power Preview. Years go by and somebody claims to have a prototype of the game and posts screenshots of the game with super weird images and texts and ends up destroying it. Turns out the thing was fake, but sometime later, a Japanese auction of games included Force Ape and was a legit prototype, with the game being even more outlandish than the fake. Monster Party's uncensored version was also thought to be a legend until it too was found on Japanese auction as a prototype, as the Japanese version was cancelled. Dexter's rude removal was thought to have been fake for a long time, since it was a word-of-mouth episode that was shown in closed doors at conventions, and the premise sounded fake to many people. It was confirmed real when Adult Swim released it to their YouTube page for a short while before removing it while later.